Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It's one of these occasions where I feel very grateful. I'm more than a sword's length from many of my colleagues in the Chamber as I declare that I'm a shareholder in the Bank of Scotland, which of course came from my 30 years of employment. That ceased nearly 20 years ago. A few facts about what's going on. Spice tell us a third of bank branches in Scotland have closed in the last 10 years. Which found that 78% of consumers in the two lowest income households rely on cash, with 26% saying they never use card payments. And among over 65s, 80% are reliant on cash. And research by Reuters showed that 90% of bank branch closures in the last year have occurred in areas where the median household income is below the national average. So what this is telling us is, yes, we're having closures, but they are adversely affecting those least able to cope with these closures. It's a socially discriminatory activity which we will all pay the price for if it continues in the way it is. And indeed, where ATMs are concerned, they're closing across the UK at a rate of 250 a month. Just a little observation about ATMs in Scotland, of course, should not be closing so fast. Because the Scottish banks issue their own banknotes, they can actually fill the cash dispenser at no cost beyond the printing of money, whereas in England you have to pay £1 for every pound that you put in the cash dispenser. So it's much cheaper to run ATMs in Scotland. So we shouldn't see the same rate of closures. Typically there'll be £40,000 in a cash dispenser. Now, banking is actually a very simple business, although bankers seem to make it look very difficult. You take some money in and reward the people who give you the money from deposit. You lend money out and you charge people, and there's a transaction system sits in the middle. And to make banking work, you just need to get the two sides of the equation at work. Now, why did bank branches develop the way they used to? And the answer is because the rural branches were typically where people deposited money. And they came into the cities, and in the city branches, you lent the money out. Because that was the model, traditionally, of banking, the Trustee Savings Bank in particular, that you funded the lending from your depositors. And that was a safe model for banking. One of the contributors to the bank crash in 2008 was that banks had increasingly gone to the wholesale markets to get money and had moved away from keeping the two sides of the banking in balance. And that didn't help. I just want to say, in my previous constituency, they changed the boundaries in 2011, in New Deer, the Clydesdale Bank announced they were going to shut the branch there. That community of some 600 people was outraged by this, got themselves together and bought the bank branch, and then persuaded the Royal Bank to move in and run the bank. And it's still there to this day, in face of all these closures. And that was very largely down to a dear and now departed colleague, Councillor Norma Thompson. But of course, she was one of a whole range of people in the community. And the point I'm making is that there is potential scope for community action and making banks responsive to the communities in which they operate. And let me just close by giving a very particular example of the risk that banks are taking in disconnecting themselves from the communities. And it comes from South Africa in the early 1990s, where in the townships of Soweto and Khayelitsha and elsewhere, people who had informally built their houses wanted to regularize their position, start to get engaged in the formal banking system. The traditional banks would have nothing to do with these people whatsoever because of their situation. What actually happened? They set up their own banks and deserted the traditional banks. And that's potentially what will happen to Bank of Scotland, the Royal Bank of Scotland, the traditional banks here. And if you think that today the population of Soweto is 1.27 million people, it is not a trivial matter that these people have deserted the traditional banks and taken their own banking fate into their own hands. And the same sort of thing can happen in Scotland. So these so-called commercial decisions ultimately can be in the commercial disinterest of these organisations that are devastating so many communities, particularly those who are most affected by the closure of banks, because they are those who have least in our society already. Presiding Officer.